In 1964, U.S. Navy Petty Officer S.M. Brannigan intercepted something that would expose one of the government's darkest secrets. Soviet forces were frantically tracking an unknown craft breaking apart over Europe, and within hours, 3 nations mobilized in a massive cover-up operation. But what they recovered wasn't just wreckage. It was evidence so shocking they're still silencing witnesses today. The truth about what crashed that night lies in the strange, cursed area that surrounds it. You won't want to miss this one. On a quiet evening in February of 1964, a U.S. Navy third-class petty officer named S.M. Brannigan sat at his monitoring station in the Caribbean. His job was pretty straightforward. He would basically just listen to radio transmissions all day, particularly ones coming from Soviet vessels and military installations. And usually, these transmissions were totally routine. But on this night, as Brannigan was going through his normal monitoring duties, he picked up this transmission that immediately caught his attention. It was a Soviet military communication, and they were frantically discussing some kind of craft that was malfunctioning over Europe. The Soviets were saying this craft was literally breaking apart in midair. And as Brannigan continued listening to this transmission, he learned that pieces of whatever this craft was were falling in 2 main locations. The larger section was heading towards an area called Penkridge in England, specifically around this place called Cock-Sparrow Lane in Cannock Chase, and then a smaller piece was falling somewhere along the border of West Germany. Brannigan knew right away this was a significant intercept. This wasn't just some routine military chatter. The Soviets were genuinely alarmed about whatever this craft was that was breaking apart over England. So Brannigan immediately reported what he had heard of his chain of command, and within only hours of his intercept, a massive military response was launched. Air Force intelligence teams were immediately mobilized, and NATO forces were put on high alert. The British military also jumped into action, and they actually coordinated with local police in the Penkridge area to completely lock down the whole region where this craft was supposedly going to crash. Now, according to various sources who were involved in what happened next, when search teams reached the Penkridge crash site, they made an absolutely stunning discovery. Now, the details about these bodies were kept extremely classified, but the fact that bodies were recovered at all was significant because it suggested that whatever crashed wasn't just some satellite or piece of military hardware. A local man named Harold South would end up providing one of the most compelling pieces of evidence about what actually happened that night. Harold lived in Bloxwich, which wasn't far from the crash site, and he was driving his van in the area when he suddenly came upon this military roadblock. And what Harold saw, this roadblock would stick with him for the rest of his life. As Harold sat in his van, waiting to be cleared through this checkpoint, he noticed this massive aircraft transporter parked off to the side of the road. And on this transporter was what he described as a delta-shaped object that was partially covered by a tarpaulin. Harold actually had his camera with him and managed to snap a few photos before military personnel noticed what he was doing. When they spotted him taking photos, they immediately rushed over to his van and demanded his camera, and Harold, who was pretty intimidated by how aggressive they were being, just handed it over without protest. They then removed the film from his camera, and surprisingly, they actually gave the camera back to him, just without the film. Now, this incident might have just become another unverified UFO story if it wasn't for what happened nearly 30 years later. In the 1990s, a paranormal investigator named Nick Redfern managed to track down Harold South to interview him about what he'd seen that night. And during the investigation, Redfern uncovered something really fascinating. He found records showing that 2 airline pilots, Captains Morrison and Bethos, had reported seeing a strange craft entering UK airspace in March of 1964, which is right around the same time as the crash. But what happened the morning of Redfern's interview with Harold South was even stranger, because just before Redfern arrived at Harold's house, he received this really strange phone call. It was basically a warning telling him to not talk about what he'd seen back in 1964 with Nick. And when they later traced this call, they discovered that it had come from a military operator connected to the MOD Guard Service at Whittington Barracks in Litchfield. This warning call really rattled Harold. I mean, here he was nearly 30 years after the incident, and somehow the military knew he was about to be interviewed about what he'd seen, and they were still trying to keep him quiet. The British Ministry of Defense had one simple response to this. Every time someone had filed a Freedom of Information request about what happened that night, they just flat out denied having any records of it whatsoever. They basically just say that they don't have any records of it, it doesn't exist, on paper, that they don't know what the person is talking about, anything they can to gaslight the individual. But there was one man by the name of Leonard Stringfield, and he wasn't just a random UFO enthusiast. He actually had some pretty impressive credentials. He actually worked at the head of public relations for this chemical company in Ohio, but more importantly, he was the early warning coordinator for something called the Condon Committee, which was a government-sponsored UFO research project. And after investigating the case, he was convinced that something really significant had happened that night, and he documented everything he possibly could and kept pointing out that there were these strange details that didn't add up, like the fact that there was such an overwhelmingly massive military response to a crashed satellite location or even an experimental aircraft. It didn't make sense. Not to mention all the additional eyewitnesses you had, spanning multiple agencies and multiple countries, all involved in whatever had happened that night. What's really fascinating is that it happened the same year as another very famous UFO incident in Socorro, New Mexico. But the Pankridge case was different because it wasn't just about lights in the sky or strange objects. There was an entire international aspect to it. You had Soviet forces that were tracking it, and then you had American intelligence intercepting their communications about it. You had British military scrambling to recover whatever it was that crashed. And so it's like this whole chain of events that started way up in the atmosphere and ended in this little English town. And despite all the evidence, despite multiple witnesses coming forward, despite documented military involvement and all the warning calls to Harold South in the 1990s, the official position hasn't changed a bit. The Ministry of Defense still maintains that nothing unusual ever happened in 1964, but for some reason, all of it still remains very classified to this very day. And the Pankridge incident remains one of Britain's most significant UFO cases. Now, the area in which this episode revolves around is simply very strange. This massive 26-mile, yes, mile and not kilometer, sorry everyone from the UK watching, stretch of wilderness that's really popular with hikers and cyclists, and even during most days, the trails are just packed with people enjoying the outdoors, and they're coming and going, and to put it simply, Cannock Chase is just weird. In fact, to give you all a greater understanding of just how strange things are, we need to go way back to 1907. During this time, strange things were happening all around the countryside. Horses began turning up dead, but not from natural causes, and they were being mutilated in ways that just didn't make any sense. In fact, the killings were so brutal that the police actually arrested a local man named George Idalgi for the crimes. But George was completely innocent, and while he sat in jail, the mutilations continued. Whatever was responsible for these attacks was still out there, and people started seeing something in the woods that nobody could really explain. Unfortunately, George served 7 years of hard labor for the killings, but after Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote an expose on the killings in 1907, pointing out problems with the evidence, a committee was formed and exonerated George. And over the years, people have proposed a lot of things, from an escaped exotic pet to a trained animal assassin, a giant bird, or even a man disguised as a horse. However, others thought that they all knew too well what was killing these horses, and they blamed the mutilations on an animal that is seen in the chase to this day, a black panther.
No, not that Black Panther.
Remember, this is England we're talking about, so there are no panthers. And no, not that panther either. Or at least there shouldn't be. But that doesn't keep people from reporting them for whatever reason. In fact, if we jump forward many years to the 1960s, Well, it just doesn't slow down. On a cold, wintry, and foggy day, a woman named Sally and her husband were simply walking through a foggy section of the Cannock Chase, and they couldn't see very well. It was the late 60s, and the day was spooky to begin with, just with the weather being the way it was, all wintry and cold, and so they stopped in the middle of the path and they started discussing their plans for moving forward. Should they continue going further or head back because visibility was poor? But both of them start to make out distinct shapes getting closer and closer, and Sally could spot what looks like maybe a low black pole or a tree stump that's on the side of the trail. Now, curiously, she closes the distance and begins to notice everything is wrong. Whatever she's looking at has ears and that something is stretching off to one side. Now, the couple continue closing in the distance, and they are just as confused as ever. And that's when they realize what they're looking at is a black panther that is sitting straight upright. And it's just casually staring at them through the mist. Even more bizarre, scattered all around the panther are these smaller shapes, about 8 of them. And you might be thinking, well, panther cubs, right? But they were actually just regular house cats. And each one of these house cats almost seems transfixed by the panther in the center, staring directly at it as if worshiping it or something. And Sally and her husband didn't know what to do, and in order to get back to their vehicle, they would have to pass this odd feline gathering. So they just did their best to put as much distance between them and this panther army, slowly and carefully kind of tiptoeing past. And once they made enough distance, they just rushed all the way back to the car, hopped inside, and they never came back to the area again. Now, fast forward to 1996, and a woman named Eileen Allen was walking near one of the cemeteries in Cannock Chase. And it was a very early evening, and Eileen kept getting this really uncomfortable feeling like she was being watched. At first, she did her best to ignore it, just telling herself that she was being too paranoid, but then she turned around and saw something. Standing there between the headstones, maybe 30 or so feet away, was this massive black panther. Now, completely confused and terrified by what she was seeing, it just vanished. And when it did, she heard this weird electrical crackling sound. Now, naturally, she got out of there as fast as she could and just never returned, but for several days afterward, she said that she was plagued by late-night phone calls. Every time she'd answer the phone, she'd get the I mean, not really, but no one would be on the other line. Just a brief pause, and then someone would click and hang up. Now, fast forward again to 2000, and a man named Bob Parker was out walking his corgi on a Sunday morning in Cannock Chase. And, Bob was a pretty no-nonsense kind of guy. He worked as an accountant and wasn't the type to make up stories or believe in anything remotely supernatural. So he didn't really have any expectations of anything strange happening, but they reached about a quarter mile of the cemetery where Eileen had her sighting, and before he realized something bounded into view, it was an immense black panther. Now, according to Bob, the panther literally dive-bombed, were his words, straight into the ground and vanished. Now, safe to say after that experience, they stopped going anywhere close to that area altogether. On the morning of October 10th, 2014, a 57-year-old woman named Christine Hamlet walked into the Cannock Chase forest in England carrying a camera and a pan filled with water. She was there with her husband David, who kind of hung back and watched as Christine made her way towards this clearing near the visitor center. But Christine wasn't there to go hiking or enjoy nature. She was actually there as a medium. Christine had spent years helping the spirits of children cross over to the other side, and on this particular morning, she was attempting to make contact using this special technique that she developed involving a pan of water. And the way it worked was Christine would see this pan of water down on the ground, and then she would take photos of the water's surface. Now, she believed that spirits would use the water as a way to kind of show themselves, kind of like using it as a mirror. And so she set her pan down in this clearing, and she began snapping photos of the water. And her husband David just kind of stood off to the side and watched his wife do her thing, but when Christine got home later that day and looked at the photos she had taken, she saw something in one of them that really bothered her. In one of the photos, staring back at Christine from the water's reflection, was this face. It looked kind of like a child, but its eyes were completely black, like two voids where normal eyes should be. And the expression was not peaceful, innocent, or anything remotely pleasing. Christine later suspected that this girl, assuming it was a girl, had unfortunately passed away in child labor in a Victorian workhouse, and then her body thrown to the side and buried in an unmarked grave. And that this is why her spirit remained restless nearly 2 centuries after. Now, only a few months after Christine captured this photo, another paranormal investigator named Joshua Lester Rigg decided to do his own investigation of Cannock Chase. Joshua had heard about Christine's photo, but he was more interested in doing a nighttime investigation using his own equipment. And so one night, him and his friend went out to the Cannock Chase with his K2 meter, which measures electromagnetic energy, and some other audio recording equipment to try and capture EVPs, which are electric voice phenomena for those who don't know. And as he's walking through the forest that night, his K2 meter suddenly begins going crazy near this particular area. And that's when he captured something really interesting. He took a photo of what looks like a spirit or ghost of a lady, which supposedly shows the ghost woman of Cannock Chase. And after this, he and his friend went off to gather more readings near one of the major cemeteries. This particular cemetery was special because this was the final resting place of over 5,000 German soldiers, many of who died during World Wars I and II. And it really just goes to show you how much darkness is packed into this area's history. I mean, even before German soldiers were buried there, the Romans who first settled this area called it the Grey Woods, just because of how eerie and unsettling they found it. But what's interesting is that the paranormal activity in these woods wasn't just about ghosts, ghouls, or spirits. In March of 2006, the Birmingham Post reported that a group of locals encountered a 14-foot-long snake while walking near the Birches Valley, where Christine had photographed the ghost of the black-eyed girl 8 years later. All of them reported the same description, which was a powerful head and coloring that stood out sharply against the greens and blues of the bracken. That might not be odd in other parts of the world, but remember, this is England. There aren't supposed to be any panthers or snakes or, well, snakes, yeah, but not 14-foot snakes. England isn't supposed to have crocodiles either, but one was reported, you guessed it, near Cannock Chase. In the summer of 2003, a group of people were hanging out at Roman View Pond, which is a small body of water about a mile away from the Chase in England. And as they're just kind of relaxing by the water, suddenly they see a massive disturbance in the pond. The water began churning and splashing violently, and they thought initially that it was just a big fish thrashing around in there, but whatever was causing this commotion was way too big to be any kind of fish in that pond. And as they're watching this thing move through the water, they start to be able to see its head and see how flat it was, and its body, which was about 5 feet long with this 2-foot tail behind it. And I mean, it's not hard to realize when you see a crocodile. Realizing what they were looking at, they immediately called the police, and because of the claim, the police showed up pretty quickly and they searched the entire pond. I mean, they were taking this really seriously because if there really was a crocodile, I mean, it would be incredibly dangerous for anybody who came near it. But after searching, they couldn't find any sign of this thing. There was no tracks, there was no evidence it had ever come out of the water. And it was like whatever these people had just seen had just vanished entirely. Now, interestingly, the people living in the area around the Cannock Chase had actually been talking about some kind of monster in the waters for at least 50 years before the whole alligator incident. And we're not talking about just a couple of people here and there. I mean, there was lots of different sightings by different people over all of these years. And in fact, on August 12th, 1976, a 52-year-old factory worker named Norman Dodd pulled his car up to the small pond near the village of Sitting Mill in England. And at this time, Norman worked at a factory nearby, and he had this routine where every day during his lunch break, he would drive out to this pond, sit down, and just eat his lunch while enjoying the peace and quiet. And this pond was actually surprisingly small, maybe 20 by 30 feet across, and surrounded by all these trees, but Norman really liked coming here because it was so isolated and peaceful, and he'd been doing this for months without any issues at all. And Norman was known around town as being a very practical, level-headed guy. And so after parking his car near the pond, he got out, walked over to his usual spot, and sat down to eat some lunch. And as he's looking at the water and just kind of watching the ripples across, he went to take another bite, but he noticed something moving in the water. And so he thought it was weird because there was a lot of movement in the water, and he's like, man, that's a pretty big fish. And so he pulls the sandwich down and he starts to get a closer look. But then the water starts really rippling and thrashing, and so Norman slowly kind of pulls himself back, and then before his very eyes, something began to emerge from the pond. Now, the second it broke the surface, his first thought was that this is way too big to be in this pond because there's no way something of this size could stay submerged in the pond because of how large it was. It was this kind of flat snake-like head that broke through the surface, and then behind this long neck, after it became visible, appeared these almost sets of flippers. And all in all, it was probably about 7 feet long, and it had this smooth, dark skin that was glistening in the sun. But Norman was too terrified by the sight, and he didn't really know what to do. He just was stuck frozen there watching this sea monster, whatever it is. And the entire time he's thinking to himself, nobody's going to believe this. This is incredible. And as this was going on, it's like it completely just ignored his presence there. It didn't even care. And it kind of pulled itself up to the shoreline, dragged itself, I should say. And it moved with such deliberate fluid motion that it didn't seem normal. And once it got itself up to the bank, it kind of just began basking in the sunshine like it did this every day, and it was a very, very normal routine. And Norman realized that as all this was going on, he was completely alone with this thing. I mean, there was no other witnesses around. If this thing were to devour him or do something to him, he would be screwed. And after a minute or so, it kind of just glanced over at Norman, and then almost kind of like glided back into the water and completely vanished, making no disturbances at all. And as soon as it went back under, the pond went back to being completely still. And as you could imagine, seeing and experiencing something so surreal like that would make you question not even your own sanity, but you start to think, did I just hallucinate that? Like what even was that? But then he went over to investigate where it had pulled itself up on shore, and he could see wet trail marks on the ground from where it had come up. And he realized that it had actually happened, that it was real. But because the year this happened, he didn't have a camera with him, so it is what it is. But what makes that particular story so interesting is where that pond is located. It's in the Cannock Chase, and the entire region, as you guys now know, has this long history of really strange things and events and sightings, and people have been reporting unusual things and creatures for years. And so there's just this bizarre pattern of unexplained phenomena happening all throughout here. And so in some ways, his sighting kind of fit into this larger mystery about what's really going on in the Cannock Chase. Unfortunately, guys, there are just too many stories to stick in one episode, so there's going to be a part 2 coming very soon, so look for that. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to all comment below Cannock Chase, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy cinematic storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, then what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.